Baudouin. She is a provincial assistant for justice and ecology for the Jesuits of the U.S. Central and Southern Province, a position she has held for the past 20 years. She has a master's in social work from Washington University in St. Louis and has worked in the social justice field in the Catholic Church for her entire career, including with Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New Orleans and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. She lives in New Orleans and is mother to 3 adult children. So join me in welcoming our guest.
Well, thanks for inviting me here today. It's really a joy to be with you. I'm here as a representative of the Jesuits of the U.S. Central and Southern Province. And my primary responsibility is as the Provincial Assistant for Justice and Ecology. And there's one of me in every Jesuit province around the world. In the U.S. and in Canada, we happen to be lay people, but in most places around the world, it's Jesuits who hold those positions. In our province, they basically ran out of Jesuits who said yes to the position, so they hired me. I am responsible for promoting the mission of the faith that does justice and reconciliation, which is a primary charism of the Society of Jesus. And the area that I cover geographically in our province covers the Gulf states, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Puerto Rico, and Belize, kind of a disparate group of states and territories, and another country. In my job, I relate most closely to the Office of Justice and Ecology for the Jesuit Conference of the U.S. and Canada. And this office is responsible for promoting the justice and reconciliation agenda of the Jesuits through networking and advocacy. And there's 2 different targets that we have for our advocacy. One is the U.S. Congress, and the other is corporations in the U.S. and Canada. I very briefly want to tell you what we're doing right now with the U.S. Congress. And we have a public policy agenda for the 118th Congress. I don't have slides for this because it's not public information yet, so you're getting the skinny on this. But I'll tell you the bills that the Jesuits are going to be focusing on this year in Congress. And there's 5 issue areas that we're focusing on this year. The first is criminal justice. We are supporting the Equality Act, which will eliminate the federal sentencing disparities between people who are convicted of crack cocaine use and cocaine possession. And there's a really big difference, and much of that has to do with income levels and with race. And so they're trying to equal those sentencing. They're not saying to do away with sentencing, but to make it more just. And then also ending the federal drug ban for SNAP eligibility. SNAP is otherwise known as food stamps. And if you have a felony, if you've been convicted of a felony, you're not eligible for those food stamps. The second area that we're looking at is immigration, and we're supporting the restoration of asylum and ending Title 42. And Title 42 was implemented when was re-implemented when COVID came about, and it kept many immigrants remaining in Mexico and would not allow them to apply for asylum in the U.S. There's been movement to lift that ban, but there's a lot of pushback against lifting it. So we're trying to make sure that they do lift the ban. And also to improve, one of the things that's happening right now on the U.S. border is that people who are trying to immigrate here, even if they have very good asylum cases, if they're escaping violence and they're escaping threats against their lives and their children's lives, they have to apply for asylum in the U.S. through an app on cell phones. Now you can imagine how difficult that is, even getting access to Wi-Fi, getting access to a cell phone. They can't cross until they apply on the other side of the border. So it's just become a huge mess, and so we're trying to help them, to get Congress to straighten out that big mess that's there. The third area that we're focusing on is the environment and supporting the Environmental Justice for All Act, which would establish different kinds of requirements and programs to address the disproportionate adverse effects of environmental effects or federal laws, federal programs, particularly those impacts on communities of color and low-income communities, or tribal or indigenous communities. The fourth area is economic justice, and the primary piece of legislation that the Jesuits are supporting is an increase in the child tax credit, which right now, in 2021, families that had children could get a tax credit of $3,600 for the first child and then $3,000 for each additional child under the age of 17. That was reduced in 2022 to $2,000 flat rate per child. Anybody is eligible for this as long as a family makes less than $400,000 a year. The tax credit is particularly helpful for low-income families when they can get this tax credit. And then the final area that we're focusing on is Native Americans, and we're supporting the Truth and Healing, I have to read this because it's long, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools. And that will be a commission that's going to look into the impact of the policies that the U.S. implemented in setting up and requiring Native American children to go to boarding schools. Several of these boarding schools in the U.S. and in Canada were actually run by Jesuits, and there's some very interesting research that's being done in them right now. You might want to have the researcher who's here in St. Louis come. So that's the legislative agenda that the Jesuits work on. That's one form of advocacy that we do. The other form of advocacy that we do is socially responsible investing. Anybody know anything about socially responsible investing? No? You don't?
A little bit.
I'm sorry, you do? What is it?
Just not like profiting off of like places or companies that do poorly, like just things.
Right. So that's one piece of it is investing in companies that do good, that promote healthy communities, safe communities. The other piece of it is actually trying to impact those companies, which is what we do. So basically, what socially responsible investing is, and the way we do it with the Jesuits, is it's using the investments of an institution, whether that would be a school, a hospital, a retirement fund, a religious congregation like the Jesuits, to try to bring about social, economic, and environmental justice in corporations. It started in earnest as divestment, which was actually pulling money from corporations that were doing wrong. And it started primarily in South Africa during the apartheid regime, when there was terrible racial segregation there. And so U.S. institutions, U.S. particularly religious congregations, started pulling their money from corporations that were doing business in South Africa. And some institutions are still using the divestment strategy and pulling their investments out of things like fossil fuels. A number of Jesuit universities have pulled their investments from fossil fuel companies or from companies that practice mountaintop removal. In fact, the Vatican has divested from fossil fuels. in response to Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. Next. So one of the things that we do with our investments, and this is based on the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops policies on investments, is that we screen what we invest in to make sure that we don't invest in certain things. We make sure that the portfolios that we have are based on social or environmental criteria. Make sure that we don't invest in companies that do harmful things, like produce anything that would be related to abortion, gambling, tobacco, and weapons production. Some provinces, two of the provinces in the US and Canada, assistancy, have actually divested from fossil fuels. That's the Midwest province and the Canadian province. We also try to invest in companies that make, I'm sorry for this mess up. Oh, sorry. This is messed up on my sheet, it's not messed up there, which is good. We try to invest in companies that make positive contributions to the larger society, that perhaps that produce green sources of energy or produce housing for low-income people. And the other thing we can do is invest in companies, or use companies to manage our investments that share our values. There are a number of Catholic investment companies. Ascension, which is actually one of the headquarters, is located here in St. Louis. Domini, Christian Brothers, Trillium, Calvert, which is actually run by the Mennonite community. I've had an investment in a Calvert fund for a retirement fund in the Calvert fund for many years. I know that they screen well, that they do good alternative investments, and my returns on my retirement account have been just as good as my returns in a more traditional retirement account. So you can make money while doing good. The other thing we can do is make alternative investments that are designed to provide capital to groups that find it hard to get capital. Could be for things like to help preserve family farms, for loans to start up small businesses, investing in, putting your money in community-based credit unions, the construction of housing for low to moderate income people, or alternative loan funds. I'm from New Orleans. After Hurricane Katrina, a group of religious investors started a fund called the Isaiah Fund, and it was for rebuilding for groups or low-income housing or nonprofits that could not get traditional investments. And so this group invested, they got agreed to a 1% return, and were able to make investments in a number of rebuilding projects after Hurricane Katrina, which made a real difference in those communities. Next. So we also, besides the screening and the alternative investments, what we do through the Jesuit Committee on Investment Responsibility is that we focus on shareholder advocacy. And we try to influence corporate behavior and policy decisions through several means. One is we vote proxies. Do you know what a proxy is? Yeah. So every year, if you're invested in a company, you get to vote on several issues that are before all of the shareholders. And the company has to send you a proxy, and you get to vote. And you get to vote on things like who the board members of that company are going to be, whether or not they should have, the shareholders should have a say in how much their executives get paid. And sometimes there are shareholder resolutions that shareholders will file about different issues. And so we get to vote on those. I vote on proxies for the UCS province. And one of the things that, even if there's not a shareholder resolution, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, I look at things like, is the board diverse? Do they have people of color on the board? Do they have women on the board? And how much are those executives actually getting paid? Which is, they get very, in those bigger corporations, they get really big salaries, but they also get huge chunks of stock. So they're making a lot of money. We can also file shareholder resolutions, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And then we also engage companies in dialogues on issues of moral and ethical and social and environmental concerns, where we actually sit down with the leaders of those companies and talk to them about issues and policies and concerns that we have with very specific asks of them that we would like for them to act on. Now, who does shareholder advocacy? Well, schools or hospitals or foundations, pension funds, teachers' pension funds, firemen's pension funds, policemen's pension funds, and unions. Socially responsible investment firms also do shareholder advocacy, and then religious organizations like the Jesuits and many other religious congregations. We do this as part of a national organization called the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, which has about 300 members, and they're made up of small religious congregations. The religious sisters have been involved in this for many years, and they're fierce when they go into dialogues. And it's also made up of larger religious organizations, like universities that have a religious affiliation. Go next. So some of the steps that we use in shareholder advocacy. First of all, we identify what issues we're concerned about. That's changed over the years, but right now the biggest concerns that the Jesuits are focusing on are human rights and environmental and water sustainability. And then we research what companies we might be able to impact. And those have to be companies that are publicly held. What that means is that you have to be able, other people have to be able to buy stock in them. Some companies are privately held, which means only like the board of directors, a very small number of people can have stock in those companies. But if it's publicly held, anybody can buy stock in those companies. So we have to have companies that are publicly held. And then we purchase the minimum amount of stock that's required to file a shareholder resolution. Just 2 years ago, the minimum amount was $2,000. And then companies really do not like shareholder resolutions. So they pressured Congress, and now you have to invest $20,000 in order to file a shareholder resolution. So we are only able to take the lead on filing those resolutions with the Jesuits for one of those companies at a time, because $20,000 is a lot of money. We have what we call an advocacy portfolio, and we set aside part of our investments just so that we're able to do this kind of work. And if you're going to be the lead in filing a shareholder resolution, you got to file a $20,000. You've got to invest the $20,000. But we can also chime in on other people's other groups' resolutions if we just hold $2,000 worth of stock. So we have this little advocacy portfolio. I have to say that it does very well. Some of the companies that we try to really impact have been very lucrative in terms of the gains that we've gotten. We then can file a shareholder resolution, which will then go before all of the shareholders in those proxy votes to vote on. And the shareholders' resolutions have to be very carefully worded. They can only be 500 words, and the companies want to throw those out, so they'll throw them out for the pickiest little things. But we're able, so we have to carefully word them so that they don't ask the company not to do business as usual. For example, we would not be able to file a shareholder resolution for Exxon saying, don't drill, because that's what the company does. But we could ask them to, we could file a shareholder resolution, for example, looking at things like, does Exxon lobby, and controlling their lobbying of Congress or a shareholder resolution that would look at their human rights practices. Then what we can do is we kind of use the shareholders resolutions as a threat. We can negotiate with the company and say we will withdraw this resolution in exchange for an ongoing dialogue about the issue that we're concerned about. And you have till what time?
About 1:30.
Okay. So why are the Jesuits effective in our socially responsible investment work? And we are very effective in getting companies to move. The first is that every province in province in Canada and the United States purchases the same stock. And so we present a unified front to the companies. One of the things that we do look for in companies is whether they're going to think that the Jesuits are influential enough. And so we sometimes will look for companies that actually have a CEO or top administrator who has gone to a Jesuit high school or Jesuit university. We also concentrate our efforts on 3 important issues and 5 companies at any given time. And we engage in shareholder advocacy with the understanding that our conversations have to be done with the maximum amount of respect for the company, and with the idea that we will hold those conversations that we have around the dialogue tables in confidence. Even if it's a company that we really disagree with, we try to promote that we find some value in the company. I'll tell you a little bit about the private prison companies that we've been involved in trying to get human rights policies adopted. Beginning to work with those private prison companies was really very difficult, a very difficult decision for us. But we come to an understanding that the care that they are providing for people is actually good care, that they do have a role in society, but to play in society. But we have it was hard to say that we were going to be investing in companies that actually profit off of incarcerating people. And we also demonstrate our knowledge and care for the business community by encouraging their fiscal success. We want them to do well financially. That's what they're there for. Next. So currently, we're involved in these companies. Read that. The first one is Ingredient, which is actually an agricultural company. And we've been working with them on sustainability, on water sustainability, and looking at how runoff from their farms and from what they produce is impacting the environment, and getting them to adopt water sustainability practices. We were involved with a company on a similar issue, the Bunge Corporation, which is an agricultural company. And when we were involved with them for 8 years, and it was actually our province that was the lead in that dialogue with them. And they went from, just as an example, they had no policies regarding water sustainability, no focus of the company on water sustainability, to when we finally finished with them, they had set up an environmental impact committee for their board. Their annual meetings, every company has to have an annual meeting. their annual meetings went from having one line about sustainability, environmental sustainability, to to a third of the meeting was about sustainability. So in 8 years, there was a huge difference. And they brought onto their board the former head, Carol Bronner, who was the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency. So that was a really significant impact we were able to have with them. The other groups that companies that we are involved in is the GEO Group and Core Civic. Both of those are private prison companies. They do both incarceration, they have contracts with states, with the Federal Bureau of Prisons to, they pay them to incarcerate people, and they also have detention centers that they run. We were really concerned about how prisoners and detainees were being treated in those facilities. And so we got them, and this is, we've been working with them for 10 years, but we got them to adopt human rights policies that then all of their staff have to be trained on, and all of their board also has to be engaged in it. It's been a really long road with them. The Core Civic has been much more responsive. The GEO Group put us off for, I would say, 7 years. They adopted a policy that was really not very good. They were doing, their training on human rights was only about 20 minutes of orientation for new employees, and they just would refuse to meet with us, and when they did, they were really nasty about it. We filed 3 resolutions with them over the years, and they finally came back to the table, and now they have an exceptionally good human rights policy, and they brought in an outside group to do human rights risk assessments, and looking at all of their facility and how human rights are being upheld or abused. So it's been a major shift in that company, but it's taken 10 years for us. Aura Minerals is actually a Canadian company, and we were asked to get involved with this company by the Jesuits in the Central American province, specifically the Honduran Jesuits. And they, Aura Minerals is they were mining gold in areas where fresh water was, and it was impacting the water and the health of the people, particularly low and very poor indigenous communities in that area. And they were also mining on an ancestral graveyard where people's families had been buried for 400 years. So we have been working with Aura to get them to, first of all, to look at the environmental impact and the human rights impact of their mining practices in Central America. And we just finished with them. They have adopted a good human rights policy. They've been much more responsive to the Jesuits and to the indigenous communities, organizations in the Central American area, in the Honduran area specifically. Barrick Gold is also a mining company, and they are operating in the Dominican Republic. We got involved with them at the request of Jesuits in the Dominican Republic. They're mining also in an area that's impacting fresh water that not only serves the Dominican Republic, but also goes into Haiti. And so we've gotten them to look at those mining practices and the human rights impacts on the communities that are downriver from the places that they mine. And then finally, American Airlines is another big success story, and it was a fast one. We were trying to get them to disclose and to make a commitment to reducing their carbon impact. And now that's really hard, right? For an airline, like how are you going to reduce pollution when you use that much gas, that much fuel, and when your whole business is about flying. But they have made a commitment now to become carbon neutral by the year 2050. And they can do that in a number of ways. They can do that by using alternative fuels, which is actually very expensive to produce, but they can use like plant-based fuels. And they're investing now in companies that produce fuels from things like corn and cooking oil that can then be used in the planes. They can do it by adapting flight patterns. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in a plane that just circles around and around and around. That's wasting a ton of fuel. They can do it by, so they can adapt those kind of patterns. They can do it by how long they stay at the gate and keep their engines running to keep us cool mostly, because of the air conditioning. But if they can reduce that amount of time that they stay at the gates, then that has a significant impact on the amount of carbon that they put out. And they can do it by changing their planes. And again, they have 25 years to do this, to lighter models and having less weight from baggage. So, and they have hired somebody for American Airlines to specifically oversee their environmental impact. And they're doing regular reporting now on their environmental impact, so that means they have to track it. So that's pretty significant in terms of our impact on the company. Any questions so far? Keep going. So what's an ideal?
You got a question?
Oh, I'm sorry, you have a question? Yes, I'm sorry.
What is like the safest investment?
I'm sorry?
What's the safest investment?
What's the safest investment?
Oh, yeah, okay. I would say that the safest investment right now would be in green companies, because there's a huge, those are companies that are producing solar power, wind power, so I think you get a very good return on your money, plus we're able to have, cleaner environment for that. So that would be, so that would be if you're looking at specific individual companies. The other one is to invest, like if you're investing through a company, is to invest in one of those companies that I mentioned earlier that does really good screening of where their investments are going. So for example, the Jesuits, we have a money manager. We can ask our money manager to put those, to screen our investments, but, and he can do that by going company by company, or you could just do it by investing in a company that already is doing really good screening. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So what's an ideal approach to socially responsible investing? What would that look like based on Catholic social teaching? One would be to allocate 5 to 10% of your assets in fixed return community investing instruments. What does that mean? One of the groups that, for example, that we invest in at the Jesuits is Mercy Housing. And Mercy builds low-income housing for low-income people and for seniors. We agreed to take a smaller return on that investment, but it really helps. We know that it's helping those communities directly. So we might, instead of getting a 5% return on our investment, maybe we'll get a 2% return over a period of years. The second would be to invest at least 50% of assets in environmentally sustainable mutual funds or stocks. So that sounds like a big step, but that would mean taking a good part of our portfolio and putting it into companies that are into mutual funds that are either screened really well or that directly working on producing environmentally friendly products. And the third would be to set up an advocacy portfolio, which with 2 to 3 companies. At one point, we talked about possibly doing that here at St. Louis University High. So I'm not really sure what happened with that, but it was a good idea. Okay, next. Okay, so other ways that Jesuit Works can participate in socially responsible investment work would be to co-file on a resolution, if you have an advocacy portfolio, to influence your mutual fund managers to vote proxies according to ICCR, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility Guidelines. So somebody here who's managing your money at St. Louis University High is getting proxies, or the mutual fund manager is voting those proxies. So how are they voting? And it might be a question that you would ask. To make sure that those proxies are being voted, and to monitor the votes of your mutual funds managers. Now, there are some reasons why, next slide. There's some reasons why you might not be able to participate with companies using socially responsible investment tactics. The first is that your investment has to be in place for a full year before you can file a shareholder resolution. So you really have to think way far in advance. So if the shareholder resolution is going to be voted on at the annual meeting, and the annual meeting is in May, you would actually have to have your resolution in usually by March. There's a deadline. So you would have to vote, invest in that the prior March. So time is really sometimes not on our side on this. If the company isn't publicly held, so if you can't buy stock in a company, then you can't have that impact. Or if the company isn't based in the US or Canada, so the rules regarding shareholder resolutions don't apply. That is the case with one of the groups that the Jesuit Social Research Institute at Loyola University has been supporting a group called Rise St. James, which has been trying to keep a company Formosa Plastics out of their community for a while. But the Formosa Plastics is owned by owned by a group in Taiwan. And so these rules, the rules that apply to US and Canadian companies, don't apply to Taiwanese companies. So they haven't been able to use shareholder advocacy. So how can you impact a company if you don't have an investment? One is that you can seek to engage in dialogue with them, with those that are in your region, and that have an impact on your community, especially marginalized communities. Protest actions, if dialogue isn't possible, if they refuse to speak to you. Lawsuits, community organizing, and congressional testimony are all ways that you can try to have an impact on the company. And I'll give you, I just want to do a very quick case study for a group that is trying to fight Formosa Plastics. Go on to the next. So Formosa Plastics is a Taiwanese-owned company that got permits from the state of Louisiana and the St. James Parish Council. That would be like your city council. We don't have our county council. We don't have counties in Louisiana. We have parishes. And they were going to build a $9.4 billion petrochemical complex beginning in February of 2021. And the residents of St. James Parish were not informed of this decision. And it was being built in a neighborhood that without their knowledge, was rezoned from residential to future industrial use. The state of Louisiana offered huge incentives to this company. They gave them a $12 million grant for building it and $1.5 billion in tax credits. And this complex was to be located in the middle of Cancer Alley. Anybody heard of Cancer Alley in Louisiana? Yeah. What have you heard about it?
Classes before,
Yeah, so there's all these petrochemical plants and chemical plants there, and the rate of cancer in that area is 700 times U.S. average. So it's hard to deny that that company, that those companies are negatively impacting the health of the people who live there. And that this particular company, in Formosa Plastics in St. James Parish, which already has 32 petrochemical plants, that's one for every 656 residents. A lot of petrochemical plants. And half of those residents were black. And it's in the 5th district, this company was going to be in the 5th district, where 86% of the residents were black. And there were already 12 petrochemical plants, one for every 235 residents. And the residents protested this, and since it was approved, and they organized an organization called Rise St. James. So some of the threats to the St. James Parish community were increased cancer, especially lymph cancer and breast cancer, because of the emission of something called ethylene oxide. And that is known to increase cancer risk by 1 per 100 cases, 150 cases per million people. It's also a significant danger to unborn children, and because pregnant women who are exposed to ethylene oxide have been shown to increase the risk of preterm births and miscarriages. And if that project was going to be built, it was going to rest on the sites of enslaved people. So what are some of the things that how could Rise St. James, in this little community with really low-income people who didn't have investments, what have they done to impact the company? First of all, they've done public witness. So on Juneteenth, they wanted to have a service on the grave site, and they were denied. This is where the company was going to build this plant. They were denied, and they filed and they won a lawsuit allowing them to have the service. They also prayed publicly. They held an All Saints' Day prayer service on that site with a blessing of the graves by the Bishop of Baton Rouge. They also petitioned, and together with the Jesuit Social Research Institute, they gathered signatures for petitions to be sent to the Louisiana government and the St. James Parish Council to revoke the permits, and they also took legal action.
We're sorry, I misspoke on time. We're up.
Okay, we're up to it. All right, but they won. Okay, that's what.